So, Brenda, it's really, really good to see you. It's good to be with you, and really looking forward to this interview. So, for those, I will be introducing you to my audience, Brenda Snow, and we will be talking about your work and your incredible book, which I really find very helpful in so many ways. Diagnose the Essential Guide to Navigating the Patient's Journey. And we're going to get into that in some detail, but I wanted to just start off by uh, kind of where things began. And
Sure.
it's been said, I kind of like this notion that the two most important days of our lives are the day we were born and the day we found out why. And for me, I was born December 21st, 1943. And really the day I found out why or what my purpose was I think the day my first son was born, November 21st, 1969. And when I held him in my arms and tears of my wife, and I made a promise to him that I would be a different kind of father than my father was able to be for me. And really to do everything I could to create a world where men were fully healed and involved with their families throughout their lives. And it really was the beginning for me of the field that I've helped develop and been part of gender-specific healing and looking at these issues through a lens of sex and gender. So maybe talk a little bit of your origin story, when you were born and when you found out why or what your purpose was.
Sure. Well, first of all, Jed, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here with you specifically and your audience. And I'm honored you took the time to read the book. And I really hope, as I've been doing the book tour and been doing these podcasts like you, healing is a really important part of my own personal journey. And the one thing I want to continue to keep giving back to others and paying it forward. So I'm glad that I have the opportunity to hopefully share some perspectives that might heal somebody listening. That's really just my main goal is the world is a crazy place right now. And I hope that these conversations add a little bit of perspective and levity for people. So great first question to start off with. So I was born on a spring day in March in California. And I think my parents were overjoyed with their firstborn child and a daughter. And I think my dad is thrilled that he has two daughters. I think I always had this feeling growing up that did he want a boy or did he wish I was a boy? And I know we're going to talk about my dad and his role as a caregiver, but I think it's safe to say that I have surpassed all of his expectations as his child and his firstborn. As to my why, I think there's kind of two pivotal points in my life. I mean, you said the one that I think every parent feels like that shift, that internal shift that happens when you go from somebody that doesn't have to take care of somebody else to solely and exclusively responsible for a human life. And that would be, with my daughter. And again, when she had a daughter. So I take both of those responsibilities very seriously. However, I don't think that my why on my life's purpose and my life's work in not only writing this book, but the things I've done for the last, 25 years in the healthcare space became really clear for me until the day I became a patient. And that was in 1993. And I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And that diagnosis of MS, well, it completely rocked my world. And I thought it would be that the rest of my life would be dismal, have no meaning. Um, I really thought my life was over. It would just, why don't I just die? Um, I never ever could foresee that that was sort of my awakening, and really was one of the greatest blessings I've been given. And I know that sometimes that's even a bit controversial for people that are suffering at home with a life-changing, life-altering chronic medical condition. But again, it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, to kind of help people maybe synthesize how that journey might have a silver lining. And for me, it did.
Interesting. Yes. So maybe talk a little bit about your life before that happening. If I had met you before then, and we had been introduced at a gathering or party, what would your life have been like before the illness?
Oh, I think, like every, young person sort of, I was a very, well, start back, I was a very happy child. I was very creative. I wouldn't say that I was the most outdoorsy or athletic. I had a little bit of two left feet, so that's been something I've had to learn as I've aged. But I was certainly, happy, and knew that I was loved and supported, and had a sister. And we grew up in a great time in California's. It was a great time to be in California, in the 70s, and just things were great. Did average childhood things. Unlike now with the screen time, we were out riding our bikes and playing kick the can, and having neighborhood chaos, doorbell ditching people, all the things that naughty little kids do. And then as I kind of went on into my 20s, I think I was like a lot of people in that time, trying to find out my place in the world, trying to you know getting educated, going to your first job, understanding what it's like to be an adult, which can be overwhelming at times. And then I became a young mother. I had my daughter very young. So whether I was prepared or not, then taking the role of parenting on, and I was a single parent very quickly. So that had another layer of complexity, trying to navigate, you know, one household parent. How do I take care of her? How do I have this job? So I think all of those things I was trying to figure out. I had a good, I've always had a good support network. And I know we're going to talk about the importance of that role. So I didn't really think about it at that point in time, like, oh, I'm so glad I've built this network. But because I'm very social, I had a village, which was instrumental in not only helping me as a young single parent early on, but then as a person living with a life-changing illness. So I
Mm,
think those are some of the typical things that you would have found with
yeah,
Brenda before MS.
interesting. And when I read your book, it's we'll get into more in depth, but it felt to me like a true hero's journey in the sense that we are confronted with a crisis usually in the hero's journey, and we go through a whole series of then awakenings about how do we survive, where it takes us in our life, things that we learn. And interestingly, for me at least in the book, there were these two really intertwined. There was the patient journey, and increasingly I think we all face the reality that at some point in our life we're going to get diagnosed with something, and often it's the kind of thing that can be a life-threatening or life-changing hero's journey. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the illness and kind of how you found out, because that's the beginning of the journey of when you are dealing with something and
Yeah.
then you find out at some point the something is something that has a name or at least has something
Yeah.
you need to start dealing with.
This is a really, really scary time. And it's not just, my personal experience and my journey, but having had being blessed with the honor to hear, thousands of patient stories and patient journeys. I think everybody, what you just described, has that moment where they know something's wrong. They don't feel 100%. They see that their health status is changing, and they have that moment of like, oh gosh, what is this? And I've really seen it go one of two ways. Either people being really proactive and saying, I need to get this sorted and find out what it is, or people saying, it's just fatigue. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm a busy person, and not addressing it. And in the book, I call this the kind of the pre-diagnosis stage, where you can be like an ostrich and put your head in the sand, or you can go forward. I was both. I kind of put my head in the sand a little bit at first because I wasn't being validated by the medical professionals I was seeking at the time. I was sort of poo-pooed. I was treated like the nice little blonde girl, send her out the door. She's here complaining about things that, every single stressed out mom must feel. Um, and, as I got worse, then I knew that that wasn't true and that I must get a diagnosis. And I really encourage people to not be the ostrich in the sand, because until you get a name for it, until you find out what it is, one, it's really validating because there's a lot of insecurity around this time. Two, until you know what it is, you can't move forward and start to solve all of the new problems. And believe me, there's going to be many of them that you and your loved ones are going to have to endure. So for me, early on, it was a lot of fatigue, and that's where I was dismissed. I'm a person with a lot of energy. So for me, I could feel a big energy shift. Then it was my left foot and up my left leg. And then my left leg wasn't working. So by the time I was really needing a walker or a wheelchair, I mean, that's what my ambulation looked like. That was the only time that sort of some medical professionals, and wetting my pants, losing control of my bladder everywhere. That was about, so I was very sick before people started saying, oh, maybe this could be something. But it was a very, very trying time. And I just want people to know it is scary. You're at your most vulnerable. It's overwhelming, but really move forward, because until you get that diagnosis, that's why I named the book that, you're not going to get the help you need.
That's such an important reality, I think, for many people. And the work I do in gender medicine and men's health, I think often men, but certainly true for women as well. Nobody wants to have something. Nobody wants to face, this is more than just I've got and it can be fixed easily or ignored. But when we name it, and I think that's an important distinction, because sometimes we get diagnosed by somebody else that often is not an accurate reflection of what's going on with us. It
Yeah.
can either be, as you said, being poo-pooed, oh, you just have this, you don't
Yeah.
have something serious. Or once you name it and get it, then you can deal with it. You can do something about it. And you mentioned, and I wanted to just kind of ask you about this phase of this. You said for you at the time this happened, you were fairly young. You were by then a single mom, and so
Yeah.
you were had a child and didn't
Yeah.
have a partner in the home other than the child to help. And I understand your father was a real key person in helping, being the support and the helper or the helpmate and so on. So talk a little bit about your dad, because it's sometimes unusual to have a man being, the support. And often
Yeah.
women are in that role more often.
Yeah. So a couple of interesting stories, if you'll indulge me. And I think with all
Sure.
your work, Jed, with men, I hope they find it interesting, because I grew up in that family I described to you back in Southern California. in a traditional family too. Mom stayed home and was an amazing homemaker. Dad went off and had the job and paid the bills. So now if you look at it through that contents and that lens, this is the first time, because my parents had divorced a few years prior and my mother moved to a subsequent state. This is the first time Dad is now going, wait, what? Caretaking role, caregiver role, care partner role to my adult daughter, right? So that for him and for me was a very different role. But to take a step back, I think the most, and it's in the book, but the most difficult time for both my father and I was after I'd been seen by 3 doctors that told me, there was just, it was, nothing wrong. And we went to this person at a leading medical institution in California, and my dad was there with me, because at this point now my dad was like carrying me into these doctor's appointments. So I got this workup, and the doctor said, you guys need to come sit down in the office. So Dad kind of drugged me in there. We sat down together, and the doctor, instead of looking at me, shifted his total focus to my father. I became persona non grata. And he said, Mr. Snow, does your daughter have mental illness? If we told her to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, don't you think she'd do it? Do you have a firearm in the house? And, inside of me, it's swelling up. And he proceeded to tell my dad that there was nothing wrong with me, that I had a severe form of mental illness. I should be institutionalized right away. And it was my father's job to push me to sign the paperwork to commit me, because I was over the age of 18, and that he should take my daughter and leave me in an insane asylum was the words, which are like also totally wildly inappropriate for a healthcare professional at this time to say. And so that was the first time that also my dad was a big hero, because I think I uttered 2 words I won't say on your podcast, but it starts with an F and the second word is you. So you can imagine that I solidified for him that I was not 100%. And my dad at that point said, there's nothing wrong with her like that. Shame on you. Pick me up, put me back in the car, and gave me one of his infamous pep talks driving home as tears were streaming down my face. And that, if I'm going to be totally honest with you and your listeners, I did question my sanity for that small car ride home, thinking, has something happened to me? So that is, I think, when my dad really shifted to the caregiver role, and I became like, what should I do, Daddy? And at that point, he really fought, got me a final appointment with the neurologist that did go on to diagnose me with multiple sclerosis by doing a lumbar puncture and an MRI, which was at the kind of beginning of that MRI technology, and a clinical examination, and then told me on December 15th of 1993, she put her hand on my shoulder and said, Miss Snow, and to my father, Mr. Snow, she's not crazy, but she is a sick gal, and she has multiple sclerosis. So that's when everything really shifted, because I spent the next many months in a hospital. I spent time in a long-term care rehabilitation facility. My dad was driving my daughter to kindergarten every day. He was making, the toast. He was, when I was out of the hospital, he was coming over to help me. We had friends and family in the neighborhood that needed to be, organized and coalesced, and, who's bringing food, who's doing this. So I think it was a learning experience for all of us. My dad is very sentimental about it to this day. You'll see him shed a tear. And, I've never asked him this. After we met Jed, though, I did close the loop and went back and said, Dad, I met this really interesting guy, and, he's done so much work in men's health. And like, how did that feel, doing it? And he said, well, I would do anything for you. But it was the first time that I had to do that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to get it right. So in a way, my dad was as nervous as I was, but I think that's the universal truth about being a caregiver. Nobody's got it completely figured out. That's why things like this forum are so important, to share key learnings and best practices, because we were making it up like we went along as we were going along. There's no handbook until my second book, but But you know, he did the best he could. And I'm so lucky I had him there because my 5-year-old couldn't do anything, right?
Exactly. Well, it was, very lucky. He was there, and you went through this together. And uh, as you know, I shared with you that part of my excitement in getting your book is I went through a challenging thing with my wife some time ago where she was out very active and slipped on a wet sidewalk and fell and called me. I'm out and I'm down. Help me! And luckily, I was close by and could get there quickly. And turned out she was injured, and eventually got her to the ER and had X-rays done. And she had broken her hip, which was the fear that many people have. You fall and ups. Yeah, well, she broke her hip and then had surgery, had hip replacement, and during the surgery, she had a stroke. The blood pressure got too low, and she had a stroke. And so there were a couple of things that I think I want to comment in response to what you're saying is one is that some diagnoses are very clear. Like there was no question
Yeah.
when, we got her to the ER and she was older and she fell and they suspected she might have a broken hip and did an X-ray and it was conclusive, yes. And there were things that followed from that. One of the things for you, and I think for more and more people, is things are not always that cut and dry, clear. This is what happened. There's a clear diagnosis, there's a clear sequelae of what do you do and treatments and so on. And as you described, you can get some awful, advice from even medical people about that. So, um, what I'd like you to kind of get into more because it feels like you did something very different than most people, and I think I wish I had had your book when I, started dealing with my wife because it's so helpful both for what some of the things she went through, some of the things that I went through, but um, part of what you had to do from the beginning was one, you had to understand what this was with you. And it started with knowing that it was not what you were being told when you started reaching out, which was a lot of nonsense. It just didn't fit. Some of it really bad and advice, and others just, well, we just didn't know. And so you had to get it yourself. Then you had to, in a sense, talk to your doctors to try to get them to give you the care you needed.
Yeah.
And then from there, you had to start interacting with other parts of the larger healthcare system, the people that had medications and so on. And that led into, and I want you to talk about how you got from where you've described to actually then creating companies that help not only helped you to navigate it, but then made available, as you said, many hundreds, thousands of other patients you've interviewed and helped. So talk about the company or companies. I know you describe them in plural, the Snow companies.
Yeah.
They're unique in a sense. What
Yeah.
developed is a very different way of engaging the system and providing, care.
Well, thank you for that. That's very nice. And that's probably, the other passion in life's work and something that, besides my family and enduring multiple sclerosis that, I'm most proud of. So just to add some context for your listeners, this is over years. So when I was diagnosed to when I was able to sort of resemble, normal, I'm going to use air quotes, because some people still wouldn't describe me as normal, Jed. But I would say that was a good 3 years. So for 3 years, it was, physical therapy, occupational therapy. I had been wheelchair dependent, walker, cane, kind of had to learn how to re-walk, had the bladder control issues, had to, a whole host of symptom management medication to do those kind of things. So this was a lot of effort and a lot of work. I just want to, and with that, I still got very lucky. A lot of people with a life-changing diagnosis, one like MS or lupus or RA, some of these autoimmune trigger diseases, have a much more difficult road than I have had. So I just want to shout out for them and say I have a lot of sympathy and empathy. After about 3 years, there was an FDA, approved medication, and I was one of the early recipients of that. I'm not going to say exclusively that altered my course 100%, but it played a very large role in quieting my disease down, along, like I said, with all those other modalities I used. I know we don't have time, but just the power of the mind, the power of manifestation, the power of meditation. Those are things that I've been doing before they were, popular and chic. So a bunch of different modalities I used to sort of put this girl back together. But when I got that FDA approved drug, it became really apparent to me that, this was something that could help many. Nobody really knew about it. And the biotechnology, the life sciences industry were really just focused on talking to physicians. They were never talking to their patients. And I thought that was strange. And the other thing, as I looked at it, I thought, well, they don't really have a great reputation either. Could it be because they don't talk to the patients that they're serving? So that's sort of where the impetus and the idea came to say, if this is going to be the next decade of breakthrough medications for a whole host of diseases, chronic cancer, so many, why don't these companies directly work with people like me? And so that was the impetus for Snow companies, Patient Worthy. There's a few, and it was a very simple premise. I saw the power of my story. We know that that's the way people learn. Aesop's fables, why you read to children, they learn important life lessons in the form of a story. It's the way our brain takes in messages and information and sorts it and makes sense of it. And so I've been sharing my story at all kinds of nonprofit organizations, talking about the things that I had tried, that I was doing, my hopes, my dreams, my fears. And the outpouring was tremendous. I had people lined up to talk to me. I got so much email, I couldn't keep up with it. And so I thought, well, why doesn't the life science industries do something to engage with these people? So I was sort of the conduit, helping patient communities get together and created forums and opportunities for them to share their story throughout the country, whether that be in a live educational symposia or on a teleconference, a Zoom, something like this, and went on into the social space. So that's a very high level explanation of sort of the one thing that has remained true as Snow has evolved and grown over the last 25 years. Now it's a big organization. I think at current count, there's like 240 disease categories that we've had the honor and the pleasure to work in, helping patients, find their voice, helping them share their stories, working with their families, because as a segue here, I think that's one of the things we forget sometimes. When we're diagnosed, it feels like it's just us. It feels like I'm the only one with MS. Well, people at my work kind of had MS too, because they worked with me. But I'll tell you who really had MS. It was my near circle. My daughter intimately knows what that's like. My parents, my mom and my dad, the people that love me, that was their disease too. And it's really easy to think only about yourself and get stuck in this place of why me? It's just my disease. But it does affect other people. So in Snow, in the company aspect, we also tried to really be a beacon for making sure that we're talking about the ways that it affects your communities, because your patient outcome and your interpersonal success, these two things are very closely aligned. And the people that withdraw and lose their sense of self and their communities, I can show you anecdotally a million times over, tend to not do as well as the ones that speak out and keep a strong sense of community.
Well, that, what struck me about when I learned about the company that you founded and the companies over the years that you helped, basically the way I interpret it was connecting all of the important elements of real good healthcare.
Yes.
You need to connect with yourself as a person that's going through it. You need to have your family connected. You need to connect with your doctors.
Yep.
You need to connect with the broader healthcare industry
Yep.
that's making medications, that's providing services very kind. And we live in a very fragmented world, it seems, and certainly the what passes for medical care these days is very fragmented. And what you did in simple ways is bringing all these elements together so that we could all tell our stories to the people that need to hear them and the people that need to speak them. So,
Exactly.
the way I described it is there are kind of two kinds of businesses that I see operating in the world. They're the ones that do well financially. They make a good living for themselves and their, employees and shareholders or whatever. And then there's those that do good, that really provide really good care, or good services. And then there are those few that do both, that, do good and do well, as a company or as a set of care services. And you were able to do both and form a very, good company that did good for people and the company did well for itself. So that, just in and of itself, that I think was something you could retire on and enjoy and kind of
Yeah.
raise the flag and say good on. But you're continuing on. And the beginning of, at least for me, the continuing was the book that I found and came across that which I want to again hold up, diagnose. So I want to kind of talk now more specifically about one. I've written a number of books, I got some over my shoulder
I know.
here, but it's a big deal to decide to move from the doing of whatever it was you were doing. And
Mhm.
obviously you'd had to spend time just helping survive yourself and getting your own life together, and then a whole life of then taking what you learned and helping others, and then the business world. And this book is pretty recent, right? This just came
Yes, yes, it
out.
did.
And so I want you to talk a little bit about how you got to decide to do the book and what that's been like, what you were hoping to accomplish, what your aims were, and a little bit maybe about how it's done so far, since it now is out in the world, and part of what we're doing together today is let others know about it.
Thank you. Yeah. So, like I said, being the founder and chief executive officer from Snow is, going to be one of the top three things on the dead person bio of mine. It was the labor of love, and it, enriched my life in so many ways. And when COVID came, sitting at the helm and navigating a healthcare company through a healthcare crisis was really sort of like, I think, my defining moment. And then as we started to return a little bit to normal, I had looked at succession planning, knowing that, I had a great bench and anointed sort of my successor, and spent these last 3 or 4 years sort of developing her into the role. And I recently just took a step back in May. So she's assumed the title of CEO, and I'm sort of like if you will, like a chairperson emeritus type of role, while she leads the day to day. And so when I was going through that sort of let's let her shine and train her, I had a little bit more free time. And my business travel, because of sort of the COVID hangover, was still that I wasn't on the road every week. So I had been told every time I engaged with patients and went anywhere, I would always ask, do you have a book? Or you should write a book. So that was kind of always in the back of my mind. And really, totally honestly, I didn't think I could do it, you know? So when I had some free time, I thought, you know, I've always been a risk taker. I've always wanted to try something. Maybe I'll do it. So why not? So got through a lot of serendipity, introduced to a woman that was a great writing coach, Brenda. Worked with her, said, how do you do this? So she kind of showed me how to do this. We worked together as a team. And before you knew it, it started to evolve. Now, I first sat down to write, because I was in this mentor mode for my successor, a business book, which was going to be empowering female leaders. I was confident that was going to be what it was. And it just wasn't coming. Every great business piece of advice that I thought I had, I was like, oh, Simon Sinek did that, and he's Simon Sinek, right? Or, you know, it was just like, I don't know. And I was really frustrated one night, and I was lying in bed, and then it just like came over me. I thought, oh, I can't write the business book yet. The only reason I became a businesswoman is because I had become a patient, and I was a patient that led to me founding my company. So the book that I need to write is, how the hell do you become a patient? And what are all the words of wisdom I wish I had had when I heard the words, you have MS? So I was like, that's the book. And so sat back down, said, everything we've worked on, I want to throw out and redo it. And thus Diagnosed was born. And then it just flew. It just came out of me. It was all the, you know, like, it's still emotional. It was all the heartache. It was all the turmoil. It was all the trauma. It was all the loss. It was all the triumphs. It was all the new kinds of beauty, the way I saw the world with different, you know, rose-colored glasses. What are the emotions you're going to go through? And then ultimately, how the hell do you redefine yourself and still have a life of beauty and meaning and purpose in spite of these, you know, horrible life altering illnesses? And then I was like, wow, this is it. And just, it just kept coming out and kept coming out. And actually it became a longer book than I had anticipated. And so, you know, it was kind of born, and I was super nervous to put it out there, and then decided I'm not going to do that. I got it out of my chest. I'm going to leave it just for my daughter and my granddaughter. And that's it. And then I sent, you know, the publisher sends you, like, you know, your box of hard copies. So last holiday season, I gave that out. That was what I gave to people. And then the emails started coming and the phone started ringing. And it was, wait a minute, like, what do you mean you're not going to do something more with this book? Like, I needed this book. My friend needed this book. So I think it was that. And you're the New York Times bestselling author. I don't know if this is like normal for every person that's written a book, but I'm usually very bullish, and people can't believe I was so shy and nervous to put this out there, but I honestly was. And so as I got that feedback from people, they gave me the courage, honestly. They gave me the courage to do it. And then I said, okay. So then sort of took the floodgates off and said, I'm emotionally ready, and I'm okay to be vulnerable. And, you know, when it was released, it was like a Amazon bestseller, like within 12 hours. And it's just been great. I mean, I've done a lot of these podcasts. I've had an amazing reception. I've gotten emails that have made me cry, that have made me jump for joy. I mean, I've been very embraced, and I've felt very loved, which is a nice surprise. And yeah, so that's a little bit of
Yeah,
the journey. Yeah.
that's great to hear. And I think part of, I mean, the reason any book gets successful, it seems to me, are two things. And I had a similar experience. You know, I've had 17 books published, but I still remember my first one, and I remember what led up to it was something very similar. You know, I told my story. And it was one of the reasons nobody would publish the book, because I get feedback saying, it's too personal. You're a professional. You should write, from a professional point of view. You got a PhD, and I wanted to tell my own story, my
Yeah.
own journey. And what I learned after I published it is people want to hear our stories.
Yeah.
They want to hear what it was like for you, and they want to hear what did you learn, because that's interesting, number one. And secondly, is if you have a story that is not just individual, but ties in with other people's stories, then you find out people then go, yeah, I want to share that because I know other people that would benefit. And
Yeah.
diagnosed, we're all on that journey, and we're all going to have a diagnosis of some kind if we don't have many of them.
Yeah.
And there's going to be two journeys, the patient and caregivers or care partners, as you
Yeah.
describe them. And
Yeah.
I want to ask you a couple of things about the journey thus far, because part of what I found was it was a very helpful book for me right away as a caregiver.
Yeah.
So if anybody's a caregiver who's taking care of anybody, this really is a golden, you know,
Thank
opportunity to get help because we need it as caregivers. And if anybody is going through, as a patient of any kind or been diagnosed, we need to understand that there are steps and there is an experience that you can share that will help you navigate the journey most successfully. So one of my questions, just given my background and how I came to it, is the difference in your gender experience with men and women. Because
Yeah.
clearly you've talked to a lot of patients,
Mhm.
and there are women patients and male patients,
Mhm.
but I sense from your experience from the book that predominantly there were women,
Yeah.
uh, and and there are obviously caregivers that are men and women, but often caregivers tend to be women. Women live longer, men get sick, and there's often women taking care of either older men or children who
Yeah.
need,
Yeah.
care. So could you say anything about what your experience was about both sides of that, the gender side of caregiving,
Yeah.
where there's not as many men that do that, and the, gender side of the who is receptive and can tell their stories, where women seem to be at least more open to doing that, where men as a group, and there's obviously lots of
Right.
exceptions,
Yeah.
tend to be more keep it close to the chest. I don't want to talk about my thing. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little
This,
about your
yeah. This is
experience?
such an this is such an interesting area, and one that we could just, literally have an hour on this topic in and of itself. So I think to kind of go back to your first thing about the power of the story, what it does is it just levels the playing field, right? It's the commonality. And I found that it transcends race, gender, socioeconomics. At the end of the day, we're all people that feel, and we're all people that experience pain and loss and hope. And so that power of the story just simply lets you know you're not alone. And when you and your caregivers, your family are going through this, you need that nugget of hope. And that's really something that I addressed in this book. Now, to kind of transition to sort of, the patient and the care partner, these are symbiotic relationships, right? And oftentimes, while you intellectually know that, the feelings around that or executing on that is extremely difficult. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of emotions like guilt, for example. So I have talked to many caregivers um, that have a lot of guilt, male and female, but it did anecdotally, again, I don't have scientific data to this, I just have my breadth of work. But most of the men I worked with in the caregiving role had a lot of guilt for having the following feelings. You know, this sucks for me. I feel super sorry for my spouse, my girlfriend, whatever, female diagnosed person. But this has totally changed my life too. I don't get to do any of the things I want anymore. I'm not out doing the things that I loved, even with their mothers. I just had this unbelievable guy contact me last week, and he had so much emotion, really suicidal, because he felt guilty having to take care of his mother. And I'm talking about diapering her twice a day, feeding 3 times a day, still had a wife and kids at home that he was looking after, had a full-time job. So these are real, intense circumstances. And I think it's important, as the family member and as the patient, you have to release your person to some degree. You have to be communicating to your caregiver and your care partner, hey, you still need time for you. You still need to step away and put some things into your life that are joyful and that define you for who you are, not define you for just as my caregiver, because you cannot keep caring and going through this cycle. It's like the hamster on the wheel. Remember those? You can't keep doing that 24/7. It's impossible. And I think when everybody can just take a deep breath and be like, okay, that doesn't mean he doesn't love me. It doesn't mean that I'm not valued. Me giving permission or acceptance and understanding, better words, around having your own identity and being somebody that loves me and cares is so much more powerful for the long-term success of your relationship and your families than the resentment piece. And I've seen it time and time again. And I'll tell you, that resentment gets to a critical mass, and I've seen more families break up than stayed together from that one simple thing. People didn't have the courage and the vulnerability and the tool set, the skills. They need to come to people like you. They need to go to groups. They need therapy, whatever it works, to have the language and have empowered, I call them courageous conversations, so that everybody in this new dynamic and this new paradigm gets what they need out of it, so that they can keep coming back and caregiving and finding out who the new you is when you're sick together. And, I gave an example primarily of married couples, but again, this happens with moms and kids. I can't tell you how many diseases, chronic illnesses we worked in that had small children as the people affected. I mean, you want to talk about brutal caregiving. I mean, so intense. Mothers and fathers that, all their hopes and dreams for, what Johnny or Susie were going to become. They're dealing with cancer. They're dealing with, genetic blindness. They're dealing with, severe forms of epilepsy. These are really, really tough. And, severe forms of all kinds of learning disabilities that have such another layer. And, it's the burnout rate is so high. The burnout rate is so high, but you have to say to yourself, how am I going to keep coming back, especially for some of these children that are never going to go into adulthood? They're never going to leave your home. They're going to need care for the rest of their life. So all of these things, I guess the nugget I would say, don't be shy about bringing it up. Don't feel, whether you're the patient or the caregiver, that it's negative bringing it up. Don't feel that, you're sending the wrong message about, loving or being loved. These are things that will make your lives more successful. And it's probably the most important thing you actually need to do when your family hears you're diagnosed.
That's so important. It was important for me to hear that because I had all the things you're describing. It happens suddenly, for most people, and men more and more are getting into the caregiving roles, both
Yeah.
with children and adults. And often don't have the supports, don't have the friendships, don't have the groups. I was fortunate. I've been in a men's group that was very helpful. But, I had to really be honest with my wife and she with me to talk about,
Yeah.
what it's like for me as well as what it's like for her. And
Yeah.
when we would be out in public, and I think this is not unusual, because one, she's a woman and she was the one who had the stroke and had the broken hip. Everybody would say, "Well, how's Carlin? How's she doing?" And I
Yeah.
would describe, "I'm glad you care," and I would talk about where she is. But very rarely would anybody say, "Well, how are you doing? How
Yeah.
is this impacting you?"
Yep.
And when I would want to talk about, I felt guilty, like,
Yep.
you know, I don't have a right to talk about if she's got the problem. And like many men and many people, just pushed it aside. And
Yeah. Try to be
but
stoic.
that's what destroys, relationships. It keeps us in pain and unnecessarily. So that's been super helpful. And I just want to underline that as we
Yeah.
kind of get towards the end of our time today.
Yeah.
So I'd like before we wrap up to talk about obviously the book is just out relatively recently, and you're gonna, I'm sure, get more and more requests for tell me more and where can I get the book, and we'll talk about where they can get the book in a minute. But before we do that, talk a little bit about what feels next for you, because it sounds like there's some more that this book has
Yeah.
triggered, not just in wanting to
Yeah.
share about the book and your experiences in the past, but some of what you might want to be doing ahead and what might be coming after this book that you might want to share
Yeah.
that people
Thanks for that.
stay tuned with.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So, um, like I said, I couldn't foresee a lot of the things, but I know, well, I guess the one thing is I know that whoever goes and buys the book, I just want to say this, that all of the proceeds that I receive are getting donated to health related charities and things like, caregiving. I mean, that is such a need in our society right now. And as you said earlier, the healthcare system is strained. And I fear that we're going to need even more external support for people that's hard to find and navigate. So I kind of want to make sure that my efforts are bolstering up good, validated, vetted organizations that play those roles for people. The book, like I said, has sparked kind of two interesting sort of things that percolated to the top. One of them is the identity earthquake for the patient. And the second one is this caregiving thing. It's just everywhere. And while this book addresses small parts of that, I have been asked by so many people about the caregiving piece. So to me, there's a real unmet need out of there. So I'm literally contemplating right now a second book that's just, called Caring, the essential guide to navigating the caregiver's journey. Um, and try to sit down and write that as a companion to this book. So that's one of the things. And then, again, supporting those nonprofits, but looking and kind of trying to do due diligence and saying, okay, if I'm going to start a foundation, where really are the big gaps? Not unlike when I started my for-profit business, there were big gaps in the education of life-changing medications. So where are the big gaps that society is going to need, and how can my skill set, my contacts, fundraising, fill those gaps? I've got a few ideas of where those are at. Maybe a little premature, but I'll just say this one, we have a lot of working people that can't get adequate health care coverage and don't have a war chest to spend on medical bills or medical care. So those working people need a lot of, and you can't lose your job because it's just a snowball effect. So
Right.
that's kind of one area that I'm trying to like focus on, learn more about, and seeing, what are some efforts that I could put forth there to help that. And I'm always open. I don't have all the answers. I've just been an open-hearted, caring person that wants to make a difference. So I'm open to ideas. Your listeners can get a hold of me at brendasnow.com. And if anybody's got any great ideas, I'd love to listen.
Super. Well, it's great, Brenda, and it's great that you have a nice, simple name and a good, simple contact that we don't have to. But as I had said to you, we will be, adding this podcast to an article and getting it out in the world, and we'll obviously be talking to you more and hearing more about what's next. But I really just from my side just want to encourage everybody who is getting a chance to watch this and to read about it is to recognize that it's about you and me and all of us, and we're kind of all in this together. And the good news is we're all in this together. So I think one of your messages, you're not alone.
Yeah.
And the other, which is, I think, a reality, is we're going to need each other more and more because the support systems that potentially have been there are often not there, or the ones that should be there that we think we're depending on are not there. So this is really, really a good time for the book, a good time for us to get more support. And this, I'm going to hold it up one last time.
I'll hold mine too.
Yeah, yeah, well, kind of
We'll do it
get a
together.
little fist bump here with Book Bump Diagnosed, the essential guide to navigating the patient's journey. And Brenda, it's just been a delight to be with you and look forward to staying in touch as time goes on.
Me too. Thank you, Jed. Mwah. And to
Yeah,
everybody listening, best of health.
back to you.